The first thing you need to know is that I didn't stumble into this chair. I bled for it. Every late-night flight, every tense boardroom standoff, every deal signed when others said it couldn't be done. Those weren't accidents. They were scars. That's why the memory of that room still clings to me like smoke. The moment the knife went in and twisted. The moment I realized loyalty and history meant nothing against arrogance dressed in a tailored suit. My name is Marcus Hale. I am 57 years old, and until that morning, I was Senior Vice President of Global Contracts at Redstone Dynamics. For 31 years, I kept that company breathing when the world tried to choke it. I closed contracts worth billions, plural. I shepherded Redstone through 3 recessions that gutted competitors twice our size. While others collapsed, I carved out new markets with nothing but grit and an unshakable refusal to bend. And still, when the son of the owner summoned me into his glass-walled office, my resume might as well have been ashes in the wind. He sat across the desk, posture casual, confidence dripping from him like perfume. Too young to have built anything, too entitled to doubt himself. His hair was slicked back, his watch gleamed, and in his voice I heard the certainty of a man who had never once lost. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "Marcus, your way of thinking is an obstacle. You don't belong in the future we're building." An obstacle. That word landed harder than the dismissal itself. I had been the bridge through decades of storms, the man who could read a negotiation the way a surgeon reads an X-ray. And now I was reduced to a roadblock, something to be bulldozed for his vision. I felt the air change before the second voice joined in. The chair beside him creaked, and the boy he called his strategic advisor leaned back with a smirk. A friend from his online gaming days, fresh from nowhere, wearing a jacket that still had creases from the department store hanger. His contribution? Negotiations are just role-play, Marcus. You've been overcomplicating them for years. He chuckled, like he'd made some brilliant point. I stared at him, this pretender, and I almost laughed. I thought about the nights I'd flown across oceans to wrestle with foreign ministers, the days I'd stood toe-to-toe with hardened executives who'd cut their teeth in blood markets, the times I'd saved this company by the skin of my teeth while the ink of bankruptcy papers hovered in the wings. Role-play? That was the word he chose. My pulse thundered in my ears, but my face stayed still. There was no outburst, no pleading. They wanted me to rage, to give them the satisfaction of confirming their narrative that I was old, outdated, unfit for their bright new age. Instead, I smiled. Just a thin, controlled line of lips that betrayed nothing of the storm inside. I closed the leather folder I'd carried for years, slid the pen back into its slot, and packed my briefcase. Every motion was deliberate, unhurried, a ritual of endings. The sun leaned back, relieved it hadn't turned ugly, mistaking restraint for surrender. The buddy smirked wider, already imagining himself walking in my shadow, wearing my victories like they belonged to him. I straightened my tie, looked once more around the office I had practically built with my own hands, and let silence speak for me. The sun's gaze faltered for just a second, the first crack in his veneer, as if some part of him wondered if he'd made a mistake. I didn't give him the gift of clarity. Then I turned and walked out, briefcase in hand, shoes echoing against polished floors. Not a single soul in that office stopped me, though I saw eyes lift from desks, whispers rise in my wake. They all knew what I had done for Redstone. They all knew what was being thrown away. But none dared speak. When the elevator doors slid shut, I finally let my jaw clench, my fingers tighten around the handle until my knuckles whitened. Fury coiled in my gut, hot and sharp, but I forced it down. Not here. Not yet. As the numbers ticked down toward the lobby, a thought carved itself into stone inside me. This wasn't the end. This was a pause, a breath before the plunge, the drawing back of a bowstring that would eventually snap forward with unstoppable force. I walked out of Redstone that morning with nothing but a briefcase, a thin smile, and a silence sharper than any scream. They believed they had ended me. They had no idea what they had just unleashed. The first morning after they cut me loose, I woke before dawn out of habit. For 31 years, my days began with contracts in one hand and coffee in the other. But now, the briefcase sat untouched in the corner of my apartment like a relic from a dead religion. The silence felt heavy. No ringing phone, no flashing inbox, no junior associate nervously tapping on my office door. Just stillness. For most men, that might have been peace. For me, it was a sharpening stone. I told no one what had happened. Not my colleagues, not the old friends who had stood beside me through mergers and market crashes. I let the rumor spread on its own. I knew it would reach every ear within hours. Marcus Hale, the iron spine of Redstone Dynamics, fired like a disposable intern. The Sun wanted it that way. He wanted a spectacle without me giving him the satisfaction of a public outburst. Fine. Let him have his whispers. They would work for me in the end. I spent those first hours reading, not contracts, but people. The news feeds, the analyst reports, the sudden shifts in tone from clients who had once trusted me. I saw the cracks forming already, hairline fractures under the glossy exterior of their so-called new era. The Sun was busy polishing his image as a visionary leader, trotting out sound bites about innovation and agility. But I had built my life on knowing what happens behind the curtain, and I could see him fumbling with the strings. By midday, my phone began buzzing. Not from Redstone, but from men and women I had met over decades, the kind who never forgot the deals I had saved or the fortunes I had protected. They asked polite questions at first, little probes about my plans. I kept my answers vague, even casual, but every word was weighed, every silence intentional. They were taking my measure, and I was taking theirs. On the second day, the calls became sharper. One client mentioned a proposal that had been left dangling after my departure. Another confessed unease with the new team. I listened, nodded, and let them talk. I didn't push, didn't promise. That was the old Marcus, the company man who carried Redstone's weight on his shoulders. This Marcus had no loyalty left to burn. I let them stew in their uncertainty, knowing that doubt spreads faster than fire. Meanwhile, I watched. The Sun strutted in interviews, speaking about strategies he barely understood, parroting phrases his gaming buddy fed him. Roleplay negotiations, the boy had said. I could almost hear those words echo in the botched press statements, in the nervous glances of staff standing behind him. They weren't building a future. They were playing dress-up, and the mask was already slipping. Still, I didn't move. Every instinct screamed to strike, to tear down the flimsy facade before it took root. But patience had carried me through tougher battles than this. Patience had kept Redstone alive when the markets turned red and competitors fell like dominoes. I knew the value of waiting until the enemy overextends. So I sat in silence, sharpening my tools, polishing the edges of contacts and favors I had banked over decades. Knowledge was my blade. Leverage was my shield. I didn't need rage to destroy them. I only needed time. On the third morning, I walked the city streets, watching Redstone's banners flutter on high-rise windows, the logo I had defended through half my life. I studied the faces of the employees rushing in, with coffee cups and briefcases, their loyalty still intact, their faith still unbroken. They didn't know yet what was coming, but I could already feel the tremor in the ground, the tension tightening with every passing hour. That afternoon, I met with no one. I sat alone in my apartment, curtains drawn, and let silence fill the room. I thought about the son, leaning back in that chair he hadn't earned, calling me an obstacle. I thought about his friend, laughing as if the weight of billion-dollar contracts were no heavier than a video game controller. And I thought about how easily they had dismissed me, believing a man who had survived 3 recessions would quietly vanish into obscurity. The fury boiled, but I pressed it down, compressing it until it burned hotter, tighter, sharper. This wasn't the time to unleash it. Not yet. I wanted them to stumble first, to trip over their own arrogance, so when I struck, it wouldn't just be revenge. It would be inevitability. By the end of the 3rd day, I was no longer restless. I was ready. Every silence had sharpened my resolve. Every moment of restraint had turned into pressure waiting to explode. I wasn't pacing anymore. I was poised, balanced on the edge of something greater than rage. All I needed was the first thread to snap, and when it did, the whole fabric would unravel in my hands. By the 4th day, the sheen of Redstone's so-called new era had already started to dull. I didn't need insider reports or whispered warnings to see it. The tremors were visible from the outside. A press release announcing a historic contract renewal was quietly retracted within hours. One of their top investors delayed a scheduled capital injection, citing unforeseen circumstances. The gaming buddy, now elevated to the title of Chief Strategy Officer, stumbled through an interview with a financial journal, confusing basic terms and drawing polite but pointed ridicule from readers who had once spoken of Redstone with reverence. These were hairline fractures in the glass, invisible to anyone who hadn't spent decades watching for the moment when strength gave way to shatter. I didn't rush to exploit them. Not yet. I let the cracks spread, let the stress build behind their polished surface. A predator never lunges at the first twitch of weakness. It circles, it waits, it watches the prey exhaust itself in denial before sinking in the teeth. My role now was to wait in the shadows and feed their doubt until it consumed them. The first move came with a phone call from an old client in Zurich. He spoke in guarded tones, his voice heavy with unease. Redstone had promised him terms that were mathematically impossible, conditions no seasoned negotiator would have ever put to paper. I knew instantly who had crafted them. It was the buddy, of course, still treating billion-dollar negotiations as some kind of improv game. I could have laughed if it weren't so pathetic. Instead, I offered nothing but silence and a murmur of understanding. I let the client come to his own conclusion, that without me, Redstone was blind, flailing, untrustworthy. The call ended with polite words, but the decision had already been made. Within 48 hours, Zurich walked away. It wasn't just the contracts. Suppliers began to call, subtle at first, then with growing concern. Delays in payment, confusion in communication, promises made and broken in the same breath. I met one of them in a dimly lit cafe, a man I had once pulled from the brink of collapse during the last recession. His voice was tight with anger as he described how the new leadership had dismissed his concerns, brushing him off with jargon and arrogance. I didn't tell him what to do. I didn't need to. By the time he finished his coffee, he had already decided to cut his shipments. I merely shook his hand and let him believe it was his choice. Each of these victories tasted sharp, intoxicating even, but I refused to take them too far. I could have pressed harder, forced the collapse sooner, but that would have been mercy. I wanted them to sweat, to stumble deeper into the pit without realizing how far they had fallen. So I let them linger in false hope, feeding them just enough oxygen to keep the flames alive while the structure smoldered beneath them. Investors were next. I arranged a quiet dinner with a pair of them in a back room of a restaurant where no one from Redstone would dare step foot. I said little, merely asked how their faith in the new team was holding up. They vented for hours, railing against the chaos, the disorganization, the boyish bravado of men who thought charisma could replace competence. I listened, nodded, sipped my whiskey, and left them to stew. 2 weeks later, their capital was rerouted elsewhere. Redstone never saw it coming. From the outside, the company still stood. The banners still waved. The press releases still blared about innovation and transformation. But I could feel it now, the subtle shift in the air when prey realizes the predator is close. The sun carried himself with forced confidence, his voice louder, his smile tighter. His gaming friend no longer smirked so easily. The jokes came less often, and the interviews grew shorter. They could sense me out there, circling, though they had no proof and no idea when the blow would land. And still, I did not strike. Not fully. I wanted them to feel the uncertainty gnaw at them, to taste the sour bile of fear every time another call ended abruptly, another meeting dissolved in silence. Their empire was cracking, but I left the pieces dangling, sharp and unstable, waiting for the right moment when they would cut their own hands trying to hold it together. At night, when I sat alone, I thought about how easy it would be to end it quickly. One decisive move, and Redstone could be gutted in a week. But where was the satisfaction in that? No, I wanted them to live with the dread, to feel the floor shifting beneath their feet day after day. Each hesitation from a partner, each delay from a client, each whisper in a boardroom was another thread fraying, another reminder that their grip on power was slipping. By the close of that third week, I had everything I needed. Allies waiting, enemies eager, a dozen doors that could be slammed shut with a single word from me. But I held back, poised in silence, savoring the tension. They were sweating now, and I wanted them drenched. The cracks had spread too far to be ignored. All I had to do was wait for the first pane of glass to give way. After that, the entire facade would collapse in a storm of shards. And when it did, they would finally understand that I hadn't been an obstacle. I had been the foundation. By the time a month had passed, Redstone's empire was wobbling like a drunk on thin ice. What had once been portrayed as bold restructuring now looked like chaos, stitched together with buzzwords. Contracts I had cultivated for decades slipped through their hands like sand, and clients who had once sworn allegiance began to drift away. The sun could no longer hide behind the glow of his last name. Every attempt at swagger only revealed the cracks spreading beneath his skin. His voice shook in boardrooms, his temper snapped in public, and every headline seemed to carry a new note of doubt. I had seen powerful men unravel before, but watching him spiral was a different kind of satisfaction. He lashed out at everyone but himself, accusing the legal team of incompetence, the marketing staff of disloyalty, the investors of cowardice. The irony was thick. The very people he berated had once been my allies, loyal to me because they trusted I would never let them fall. Now they stood beneath the whip of a boy who had mistaken inheritance for leadership, and their loyalty withered with every insult he hurled. The gaming buddy fared no better. Once he strutted with the smug arrogance of someone who thought a clever phrase could replace decades of experience. Now his jargon betrayed him, flimsy words strung together to mask the fact that he was drowning. He hid behind slides and slogans, recycling buzzwords until even the youngest interns rolled their eyes. In private meetings, I heard from those who had been forced to endure his speeches that he sweated through his suits, his hands trembling as he tapped his laptop for the next empty phrase. He was not a strategist. He was a child, wearing a crown, too heavy for his head. It was then I decided to step closer. No more whispers in the shadows, no more gentle nudges behind closed doors. I wanted them to see me, to feel me, to know that every crack in their glass tower had my fingerprints on it. The first face-to-face came in a downtown conference hall, where Redstone was trying desperately to court a wavering partner. I arrived unannounced, greeted by surprised stares and whispered gasps, and took my place across the table. The sun stiffened the moment his eyes landed on me, his forced smile faltering, his practiced lines scattering like birds before a storm. "Marcus," he said, his voice tight, trying to sound casual. "Didn't expect to see you here." I leaned forward, calm and unhurried, and let my words slice the air. Contracts are built on trust, not slogans. You can't inherit that. You earn it. The room fell silent. Every executive in attendance could feel the tension snap taut between us. I saw the partner's gaze flicker from him to me, and I knew in that instant the deal was already lost. But I didn't push it further. I stood, offered a handshake to the partner, and walked out before the ink could dry. Let the silence choke him. Let the loss settle in on its own. From that moment on, I haunted them. At shareholder dinners, I appeared in corners, exchanging quiet conversations with those who still held real power. At industry forums, I delivered speeches about stability and foresight, virtues Redstone had abandoned. My presence became a constant reminder of what they had cast aside, and with every appearance, their panic deepened. I didn't need to shout or gloat. My restraint was suffocating enough. The sun grew erratic. Reports of shouting matches behind closed doors leaked out. Stories of smashed glasses and slammed fists whispered through the halls. The buddy withdrew into nervous silence, speaking less, fumbling more, his smirk long since extinguished. They could feel the trap tightening, even if they couldn't yet see the jaws. But still, I refused to strike. Every instinct urged me to end it, to push them over the edge and watch the empire crumble at my feet. Yet I knew the moment had not fully ripened. There was more fear to sow, more sweat to wring from their brows. So I held back, denying myself and them the resolution that hung so close. One night, after a particularly disastrous investor call, I stood across the street from Redstone's headquarters. The lights on the top floor burned past midnight, silhouettes pacing, arguing, collapsing into chairs, with their heads in their hands. I could almost hear their panic bleeding into the night air. I let the sight burn into me, savoring the knowledge that one push, one whisper, would send it all tumbling down. But not yet. They would teeter on the brink a little longer, clinging desperately to the illusion of control. The final blow would come soon enough, but first I wanted them to live with the terror of knowing the end was near, yet still just out of reach. When I finally walked away from that building, I carried no rage, no regret, only patience, sharpened into a weapon. They were one breath away from destruction, and I was the hand holding them there. The morning it finally broke was not marked by fanfare or thunder. It was quiet, almost deceptively ordinary. I sat at my desk with the briefcase at my side, the same one I had carried out of Redstone on the day they cast me aside, and opened a folder filled with months of careful preparation. Every document, every note, every whispered conversation had been leading to this moment. The trap I had built was no longer a set of possibilities. It was a hammer waiting to fall. I gave the first signal, and the cracks I had nurtured split wide open. The Zurich client who had once withdrawn quietly now spoke loudly, issuing a statement about Redstone's failure to uphold professional standards. It wasn't just a broken deal, it was a public condemnation. Within hours, other clients followed. The Tokyo firm canceled its renewal, citing structural concerns. A supplier in Munich halted shipments entirely, leaving Redstone scrambling with warehouses full of empty promises and no product to move. The dominoes fell faster than even I had anticipated. Each one carried weight, and together they tore down the facade, piece by piece. The investors moved next. The quiet dinner conversations I had seeded weeks earlier bore fruit as they withdrew their capital in synchronized fashion. A retreat so sudden it stunned the markets. Redstone's stock, once considered unshakable, nosedived. The financial press smelled blood and swarmed, dissecting every error, every misstep. What had been whispered doubts became headlines. Redstone in crisis, leadership questioned. The sun could no longer hide behind charisma or scripted confidence. The market had judged him, and the verdict was clear. Inside the company, chaos ruled. Reports leaked of emergency meetings that stretched into dawn, of shouting matches that rattled the glass walls of their headquarters. The sun, once so smug, was described as pale, frantic, unable to hold his composure. His gaming buddy, stripped of his borrowed vocabulary, stood exposed as what he truly was: a fraud in a suit, a pretender who had mistaken bravado for strategy. Journalists dug into his background, unearthing the shallow truth of his credentials. By the time the stories ran, his name was a punchline. I did not revel loudly. There was no need. The satisfaction came in watching inevitability unfold, in knowing that the empire they thought untouchable was collapsing exactly as I had foreseen. Each ally I had cultivated turned their back on Redstone at precisely the right moment, and every contract that had once been their lifeline dissolved into ash. The sun had wanted me gone because he thought I was outdated, an obstacle. Now he stood at the helm of a sinking ship, powerless to plug the holes, with the world watching his failure in real time. The creditors descended like vultures. Lawsuits piled up. Demands for repayment echoed through the halls, and whispers of bankruptcy no longer sounded like speculation. The employees, those men and women who had once followed me through fire, no longer looked at their leader with loyalty. They looked at him with fear, with anger, with despair. His kingdom of glass had shattered, and he was standing barefoot in the shards. And I, Marcus Hale, stood apart, briefcase in hand, watching as judgment fell. It was not rage that filled me in that moment, nor even joy. It was catharsis. 4 chapters of restraint, of patience, of withholding the inevitable, had led to this release. No half measures, no mercy, no chance of resurrection. Redstone dynamics under his rule was obliterated. When the dust settled, I walked through the city with the weight of finality pressing down on me. The banners bearing their logo were already being peeled away. Investors were already turning to safer harbors, and the once proud building stood like a mausoleum. I felt no urge to taunt or to gloat. The gavel had struck, the judgment rendered. Case closed. But as I stood in the shadow of that ruin, I felt something deeper stir within me. This was my story, yes, but it was not mine alone. Betrayal is older than commerce, older than dynasties. It lives in every family, torn by greed, every friendship broken by envy, every empire toppled from within. Revenge is the inheritance of the betrayed, the fire carried from one generation to the next. My struggle with Redstone was only one echo in a chamber filled with countless others. I had destroyed my betrayers utterly, but I knew, even as the ashes cooled, that the pattern would repeat. Somewhere, someone else was being cast aside, written off as obsolete, laughed at by fools who mistook arrogance for strength. Somewhere, another obstacle was sharpening into a weapon, and when their time came, when their gavel fell, their story would sound a lot like mine. The hunger for vengeance, the ache for justice, they do not belong to me. They belong to us all.